Should we support the TikTok ban? Can you separate charity from its Christian foundation? And should we blame cops for enforcing unjust laws? We'll discuss these takes and more on today's episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we gather takes that we see in our social media feeds and we critique or praise them. My name's Britt. I'm here with my co-host Donnie. And before we get started, make sure to like, share, comment, leave us a message. You can find us on Instagram at Good Take, Bad Take Pod and Twitter and YouTube at Good Bad Take Pod. And without further ado, let's get into some of these takes. So the first one that we've got here is by Brendan Carr for the Wall Street Journal. And he writes, "The First Amendment doesn't protect espionage, and the Constitution doesn't require the government to allow TikTok's national security threat to persist simply because the platform also enables speech. You can use a pen to write salacious anti-American propaganda, and the government can't censor that content, nor can it stop Americans from seeking such messages out. But if you use the same pen to pick a lock to steal someone else's property, the government could prosecute you for illegal conduct. That is what the House's TikTok bill has done. It's consistent with the Constitution's letter and spirit and our longstanding approach to foreign adversary control." What do you think, Donnie?
So I like Brendan Carr. I think he's by far the best FCC commissioner we have currently. I think that the examples and the framing he gives in the first two paragraphs are fair. Like, I would say, you know what, those are reasonable points to make. Where he gets it wrong is in saying that that's what the House's TikTok bill has done. The House's TikTok bill, if it was actually focused and serious about the threat that China allegedly has through TikTok, it would not be a narrowly focused, how can we specifically get ByteDance to divest its sales in this particular way through these particular means kind of bill. What it instead does, rather than, and Vivek Ramaswamy has made this point, and I think he's articulated it very well, which is if you're worried about those types of things, then you legislate and you ban the behavior. That's the kind, in the sense that, obviously we live in a world of laws, so we don't want to, we don't want to like say, oh, you should always make a law for this. But if you're worried about things like, a law against hitting someone, let's say, like you start with a government and there's no laws against, uninitiated violence. And then you're going to school and you get, bullied by a tall, blonde-haired kid who's a lot bigger than you, and he beats you up every day. What this TikTok ban bill does is, rather than say, hey, we're gonna, you're not allowed to punch people who haven't done anything to you. You're not allowed to punch people without any sort of defense in there. The bill is like, if you're tall, if you're blonde, and if your name is Billy the Bully, like, you're not allowed to be on the school premise. That's what it does. And so the problem is that the bill is, first of all, it's not banning the behaviors. And the reason for that is because by banning the behaviors of data content stealing and privacy violations, they would have to ban what all the other companies are doing and that the government cooperates with to get data from them. Think about all of the ways in which Twitter was cooperating with the federal government during the 2020 election, and the way that they manipulated their terms of service on the pressure from the administration to ban Donald Trump and things like that. Like, there were reasons why the government doesn't ban these behaviors. It's because all of the major players do them, and the government benefits from having that domestically. So they can't ban it domestically, because then they would be implicating all of the other players who just happen to operate in the US. The other major problem is that, so the bill is too narrow in the sense that it's targeting out one company, even though they say, oh no, it's just like these four companies, like Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China. That's all it does. But the problem is the way that it it says if you're like owned by one of these countries, essentially, it's like if the principal owner is based in those countries, if like a majority of the shareholders or controlling board is in those companies, or if someone in those positions of control are under the influence and control of those countries. And that is to be determined by the executive branch. That's how that gets determined. So I think that, again, this, the justifications he gives are like, you can't use, just because TikTok is a platform that uses free speech and that expresses free speech, that doesn't make it impervious if it breaks other laws. In the same way that I would say, just because someone's saying like, I have the right to say controversial speech doesn't mean you can't arrest the guy for beating up an old woman. He's doing something wrong just because he's doing free speech while he's beating up a woman doesn't mean he's impervious to the law. And so in the same way, if TikTok, if the bill was about banning the data collection against your will and selling it out to espionage in an espionage manner, if that's what it was actually about, I think his point would stand a lot more. As it is, this is a massive, and this doesn't even address the scope of what constitutes, a website or a social media platform or an app that they as they define it in the bill. It would be, it's so broad, it's so sweeping, and it is, again, it's just a power grab by the executive. There's way more than the framing that Brendan Carr gives here.
Yeah, what's funny about any of these laws is that once you understand that all of the control that the government has and the people that are in positions of power, it's all about perceived legitimacy and what they can convince the general populace of being like, oh, well, this is legitimate because it's in a law. And when you start looking at the laws that we have on the books and how the fact that you can't literally open a lemonade stand without breaking a set of laws, you realize that they're all built up so that if a politician or someone that is a special interest group or someone that is in the deep state, that is an unelected bureaucrat, wants to get someone, there's millions of levers that they can use to get someone. It's not a matter of like actually trying to make a better society or make make the world a bit more fair or anything like that. It's that like, hey, we want to have something that we can get someone on. And with the problem, right, and the way you can know that this is happening is because, like you're saying, the bill is not very specific and it doesn't actually solve the problem that it's saying that exists. Like, yes, we acknowledge that this problem exists. The bill and the wording and everything that it goes to address it does not actually address it, because if it did address it, the people that have special interests in other areas would now be rendered, inert. And so they have to like do all this weird lawyering, meandering around. And have you ever watched the show Suits?
Yes, I've seen some of it.
Okay,
I haven't watched the whole thing.
If you've seen one episode, you've seen all the episodes.
Yeah.
they're literally the same. But my wife and I, because we have to stay up late with our daughter, and like I'm too tired to like work on anything, but I also need to stay awake. Like that's kind of the show I've been just watching. I've never watched it before. But anyways, last night, one of the episodes I watched, they haul one of the main characters in. And he's like, hey, you don't, the Department of Justice hauls the main character in, and the main character's like, hey, you don't have me on anything. And he's like, oh, well, I've convicted people off of nothing. Like, I just have to make the conjecture that like this is part of, the person that you interacted with is under the suspect of terrorism. And now I can use the Patriot Act, to get you on this and this and that. And whether or not that's like true or happened or anything like that, the spirit and the theme of that is true. And that anytime like a politician wants to get someone, they have to be able to refer to something that's written and say, hey, this perceived legitimacy is correct because it's written here and we passed it and it's by the people, even though they finagled the law in such a way that would suit their purposes. And more or less, like anytime the government wants to pass a bill, unless it's literally a one-page bill that has one sentence on it that says this is what this bill does and this is how it does it, most of the time there's other interests at play. And you can definitely see that with this TikTok bill.
Yeah, and I don't think the op-ed, if I remember from reading it, I don't think Brendan Carr goes into this. But the other aspect I commonly hear about this bill has to do with, people will sort of justify it by saying like it doesn't actually cause you to ban TikTok. They just have to sell it to American ownership. But that's as much of a choice as saying, oh, you don't have to pay your taxes. You just get thrown in prison if you don't, because the by selling the company, they would have to be selling the data and the algorithm. TikTok, I think 10% of its users are American. It is a massive global market. So there's no way they will simply be banning it in the US. There's no business. There's no reason. It'd be like saying, oh, well, they have to sell the company and they have to sell it for 50 cents. They can't sell for any more. And then they have the choice to sell. We're not banning it. You're effectively banning it by doing this, by telling them they have to sell it under conditions that make no sense for them to do. So all that I don't want to put those words in Brendan Carr's mouth. I don't know that he would be claiming it's not a ban. But I think he's got the right framing, but like it's though he wants to give the most generous interpretation of what the bill does rather than realizing all of what the bill actually does.
Yeah. All right, moving on to our next one. So the Associated Press had a headline about.
Well, just to be clear, this was actually a different tweet, but the account was banned since he did this, so it was the same article. I did see, but he is not quoting the Associated Press.
Oh, okay.
Really loud, and they apparently got removed or suspended.
Got it. So there's been some stuff about Mackenzie Scott, Jeff Bezos' ex-wife. She's donated lots of money to different causes. I think to the date, like $17 billion, and most recently $640 million. And most of it is to very woke causes. And so Aaron McIntyre had a take on this. It's pretty long, but it's let's read it because I think it's worth it. Charity is not a universal value throughout history, and the idea of giving to those outside your kin is mostly a Christian one. At one point, charity was a very personal affair. You gave it directly to those in need or to an organization to which you were an active participant, like a church. The gift was particular to your community, and you knew the people it helped. As society scaled up and massified, this work was mostly handed over to large bureaucratic institutions, which were no longer accountable to specific individuals or communities. People who wanted to feel good about fulfilling the Christian impulse for charitable giving, but could not be bothered to actually participate in a community with those in need, could instead donate to a third party who would touch the unclean for them. This separation between the giver, the organization, and the community it served introduced the principal agent problem and made these organizations subject to Robert Conquest's second and third laws. Without direct individual or community accountability, the power stored in these organizations, both monetarily and in social credit, was up for grabs. The intermediaries managing these organizations became less and less interested in the stated purpose of the institutions and instead became obsessed with growing the power and size of the charity, which in turn increased their own power and importance. The best way for these managers to grow their prestige and influence was to align themselves with the direction of the political zeitgeist. By linking themselves to the state, charities could become large beneficiaries of taxpayer funds when their allies were in power, and havens for personnel and policy when their enemies won elections. These nonprofits could also wield their power to circumvent constitutional restrictions on formal government branches. When their friends in government needed to push for censorship in social media but were restricted by the First Amendment, they can instead funnel massive amounts of money into nonprofits who would apply the pressure for them, all while maintaining the moral shield of clarity. Thus, nonprofit charities became an integral part of the regime while maintaining the moral and legal protections their status afforded. The artificial separation of the public and private sectors that has been erected in the American consciousness also allowed them to act as an arm of the state without constitutional restrictions. This is how the total state is born. Managers assemble power across public and private institutions, which they network to circumvent the ideas of limited government and checks and balances. The personal becomes the political because every private institution is in actuality a vehicle for tyrannical state power. When you see Mackenzie Scott donate $640 million, she is not giving it to the needy. She is giving it to the regime. She is pledging her support to the total state. Woo, what do you think?
This is a meaty take, but he is sort of step by step walking through the history, the trajectory, essentially leading us down the path to how we got to totalitarianism in a sense, right? This really does fit that oft quoted definition of totalitarianism from I'm sorry, I'm not totalitarianism. I'm sorry. It's Mussolini's definition of I'm blanking on the term. The people throw them around so much right now that it's
fascism or
fascism. Thank you. That's what it is. People always call everything you're a fascist, you're a totalitarian. So I'm just getting a mix up in my head. Fascism. Thank you. Where the state, all of the areas which it is limited in control and it is preempted from taking action because the state owns the corporations or the other quote unquote private entities. They do the bidding of the state. And like I alluded to earlier, like he alludes to earlier with social media and with Twitter, that's what we saw happening. Remember the emails that were leaked were saying, look, can we get this person? Here are accounts we want you to check out. This is really important. That and initially on some of the points, some of the more, major sort of this could have a large effect type of situations, Twitter was pushing back. They're like, well, our guidelines don't really let us ban for this reason. And then the White House applied more pressure and said things like, well, what if we could put it in this way, or maybe you need to change these rules, or they basically got them to conform to their will. So this was not merely a case, maybe the most blue pilled charitable take you could have for something like that was, well, the White House uh, is concerned with national well-being, and they are being a whistleblower to fake news that they see and identifying these things for a social media company. But that's, again, even in those situations where you would say that, they were actively pressuring the organization like Twitter, the company, to change their policy on their behalf. So again, the government can't curb free speech, but Twitter can curb speech that's on its platform, and so therefore it's okay. So all of this being said, the other area where this is so true is the sort of actors that get called called quote unquote NGOs, non-government um, organizations, and particularly in the foreign policy realm, these NGOs go in, again, saying they're not part of the government, but they get all the government bailouts, they get all the government funded you know projects and money that goes to them, and then they end up just sort of benefiting, in particular, the foreign establishment regime of conquest and going in. They'll say, oh, we're going to send a humanitarian mission to X, Y, and Z, but usually it's peacekeeping troops that express U.S. hegemony there, and put forward our involvement and engagement into the world to make sure that their leaders are to our liking and things like that.
Yeah, I think I'll speak a little more to like the cultural side of it. That's really interesting to me. Like charity is subject to the same human action or laws of human action that the market is subject to, and I really appreciated that. I mean, as much as Arn McIntyre didn't mention, Mises or human action in this, like it is very present in his argument, and that like, oh yeah, like charity, the causal reason that you would donate to a charity is because you see a need, and ideally you see a need that is right in front of your face or within your community, or that like you can like reach out and touch, and ideally personally affect in some way with your own actions, and if not with your own actions, directly, but maybe also monetarily and with your own actions. And that has how it's kind of been through most of history. But when that shifted and it changed, like culturally, it became like, oh well, you give to charity. If you deny that it's a Christian impulse, that there is actual good, you not only lose the like you lose the meaning behind the actual execution and the experience. And that's why people like will say things that it's always so funny to me that like a politician will hop up on a debate stage and they say, well, we just need to fund more education. It's like, well, what does that mean, man? Like that doesn't really mean anything. But it's that, for lack of a better term, and I don't mean it in the way that it's traditionally used, like that's a social credit, like that you can stock up, that you can be like, oh, like I'm for a good thing, and and it's like, oh well, I give money to good thing. It's like, well, what is the reason and the spirit and the heart behind giving money to a good thing? It's like, oh, it's because you want the world to be a better place. And to mention another TV show, did you're a fan of Community? I'm pretty sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So like, there's that one episode where Pierce has like the really far listening device or whatever, and he's able to like listen in on conversations and stuff. And there's kind of a whole storyline about gossip and how it hurts people and things like that. And at the end, Pierce is usually kind of a bumbling fool, but he has a really good point of advice. He's like, hey, like maybe our ears shouldn't be augmented because they should only be able to listen to conversations that happen, within what's in front of us. And I think that's probably the same with like charity and good works, right? Like you have no business giving, money to some organizations in some other place if you're not also like actively using your own like resources and resources and time and energy to affect the community and people's needs that are right in front of you and the people that are closest to you. When you do that, like it's actually a really important part, because if you're like, when we separate, like on McIntyre's saying, if you separate the actual underlying moral principle that of Christian charity from it, and it becomes secularized, like suddenly like charity doesn't do also for you. It doesn't change you as it also changes the world. And both of those transactions are really, really important. And they ensure that the charity and the money that is being given and the actions that are being given are used in the best way. When you disconnect that, it ensures that it's not going to be used in a good way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean that, the whole frame of mind for so many people is just, oh, I'll give money to do good work, whether that's charity or whether that's taxes for the government. But like you said, that doesn't mean anything. And that continued distance, like you're mentioning, it really I mean, even well-meaning people, even the best of us who recognize that, like I recognize in myself, it's hard to not just want to say, oh, I'll pay someone to take care of it. Because here's one thing I will say, that the market economy is really good at specialization. And
Yes.
that is a good thing in most areas. But what it does almost lead us to a frame of mind where we ourselves don't need to get involved in that, because we're like, oh, well, I'm not, the best at dealing with people. So therefore, I'm going to donate to a charity to handle, feeding the poor, or cleaning up the city, or whatever it is. We almost can justify it because we're so focused on specialization. And I think that there's a balance we need to hit, where charities that can do really big things and really important work like that can specialize and can take full advantage of that market, sort of, getting the most bang for your buck. But also, we as people need to never lose sight of our local communities and putting in that time and charity and work ourselves, because I don't think charity is something we need to specialize it. Like, that doesn't need to be, okay, charities for one group of people. I'm too busy in my own life to do other. Like, that should, every person should be called to charitable goods and works, and being connected with those around you and loving and serving others. And so the further apart we become from the actual work ourselves, the more we are to pass it off. And like you said, that leads to almost sort of the dysfunction of a market where it's not being properly allocated. So you end up with the worst of both worlds. You end up with the sort of the deferment of what specialization offers, of I'm going to hand this to someone else, but then you lose all the efficiency of
Yes.
specialization because it's disconnected, it's untracked, it's unaccountable, and you yourself lose that connection, which is so important.
Yeah, and I don't to be clear, I don't think there's anything wrong with like we give a portion of our like yearly giving is to a company called Food for the Hungry, and they do work in other countries and stuff. So obviously very far away from our local
Yeah,
community. It is not the bulk of our giving by any means or anything like that, but it is part of it. But the reason we give to that is because like I've met with the president, like we worked with them as a band. I've met with the people that work on the ground, specifically with the kid that we help out, and I've vetted it, right. And that's like, I think the act of caring about it is part of the vetting process. It's part of, like you're saying, the efficiency that ensures that your market signals to the charity are and money is being allocated in the proper places. And it's much easier to like directly understand if energy and money and time is being used if it's like right in front of your face, and it's right in front of your community, and it's at that school, or that that boys and girls club, or whatever that you drive past every day, or those people that you see at the bus stop or whatever. Like you know those folks and you see them every day, so it's easier to understand whether your work is actually being used in such a way that is efficient. Much harder when it's being sent somewhere else, but that doesn't mean it can't be, right. Like but it requires that you really think about it, right. It's not like, oh, I've got this pile of money and I'm a good person because I gave $1,000 to this or that. That it doesn't work that way, and it actually makes the world not a worse place, but it contributes inefficient signals, which means money is wasted. So I guess it does make the world a worse place in some ways, or is not as good as it could be.
yeah, agreed. Well, and another good example of that would be, just think about the like, it gets to the point of absurdity in some degrees, where like, even the needs that are in your own back door, if you think that you're offloading this, and you're paying, then those needs in your back door are not addressed. I mean, look at like the housing situation in Seattle. There are these housing units that are meant to help home people with no credit check, with no, but they also don't address the fundamental issue of the dependency crisis on fentanyl or other kinds of drugs, and they give them the paraphernalia for it downstairs. It's clean, and you go into those houses. Like, if you look at an organization like, I think is it We Heart Seattle, or I think is what it's called. They went in recently and they did some, there was some great reporting by Jonathan Cho of Discovery, up here. And it's like, you went in, and the conditions of the housing is just awful. It's just horrible. And a lot of the people there, who are trapped by this addiction, they'll say things like, we didn't on the street, at least we didn't have like rats and termites and stuff, and we want help. We want to get out of this, but we don't know how to get out of this. So there are people who want help, and it feels like the city and the government solution is pay money to an NGO, basically, or some government program that creates housing, and then just ignore them. Don't actually give them the resources they need to get better. Don't have people checking in on them as human beings. Just provide the structure and they'll fix themselves. And it's like, there's two components. Like, you definitely need someone who wants to get better to get them off of an addiction train. Like, you need that component, but you also need to have someone who's willing to help them do that too.
Yeah.
And so when we've become so disconnected and just want to throw money, we just want to have another government program created, or these, nonprofits like Mackenzie Scott's doing. Oftentimes they neglect the people in their backyard because they're just like, well, we gave enough money. What's wrong?
Yeah.
Why didn't this fix it?
Yeah. Yeah. I had a co-founder at my startup, and he had this phrase that was really true, that if you can solve it with time or money, it's not a problem. And I think the inverse of that is also true, that if you have a problem, and you won't be able to solve, if it's truly a problem, you won't be able to solve it with a bunch of time and money. No amount of it will ever fix it. Like, it's actually something that needs to have a solution to it. And time and money are not solutions. They're just levers that you can pull. And yeah, the blind giving of like, oh, well, I gave, $640 million to education. It's like, well, that doesn't really mean anything, right? Like, that's just money going someplace, and hopefully it's allocated properly. But because you're not really, I mean, I'm sure she's got people that vet it and everything, but regardless, like, in general, like Aaron McIntyre lays out, like, because we don't acknowledge, our society acknowledges that we have the impulse to give, but we don't acknowledge the origin of it. It means that we've become further and further disconnected, and therefore less and less interested in where it's actually going, other than, storing up the social credit of being charitable people, even though it's not really charity.
Absolutely right.
All right, moving on to our next one, we've got Thaddeus Russell. And he's right. He has a tweet, and this is about Daniel Penny. So for those of you who aren't aware, Daniel Penny was a subway goer in New York City. And there was a homeless man named Jordan Neely on the train. Either, I can't remember if he was homeless or if he was on drugs or something like that, but he was not in his right mind, and he was threatening to hurt people on the subway train. And Daniel Penny and several other men deemed it worthy enough that they needed to restrain him. Daniel Penny had him in a rear naked choke, and Jordan Neely passed out and died shortly after the police arrived. I believe he died at the hospital. So anyways, it's kind of been a big news story. There was Daniel Penny's attorney moved to get the charges dismissed. Daniel Penny's on trial for murder, which is pretty wild. And the judge recently denied the motion to dismiss. And so they're going to trial, and he'll be tried. I can't remember what the prosecutor's trying to get, but it's either manslaughter or murder or whatever it's going to, or homicide or whatever it's going to be. So Thaddeus Russell writes, if you know anything about jiu-jitsu, you know that Daniel Penny had many options other than choking Jordan Neely to death. What do you think?
This strikes me as the exact same kind of rationale that the people who will talk about, oh, why didn't they just shoot him in the foot? Or why didn't they just tase him?
Yes.
It's one of those things where I want to sympathize with the underlying point. The underlying point is that life is sacred. Life is, like, taking a life should be the absolute last resort, and there should be the highest standard to acquit someone of that. But when you look at the stuff that came out, the video footage, everything surrounding the situation, this is not a matter of Daniel Penny just violently acting out against someone. This is someone who was threatening other humans and putting their lives in danger. And that's the other thing you have to consider is, could he have handled the situation more perfectly? Yeah, in an ideal world, he could be able to take the guy out without any sort of death, and everyone stands up on the bus and claps. But the real world is one of, like, where you don't have all the time to consider the situations.
No.
In order to prevent harm from others, you have to act quickly. You have adrenaline going. There's so many factors, and the fact of the matter is, the other guy, Jordan Neely, was a clear and present danger to other people. Their lives were at risk. Daniel Penny was more than justified to pacify this individual. It would have been better had he not died, 100%. But in the face of what was unpredictable behavior, Jordan Neely put himself at that risk to be in a situation where he could be restrained to the point of losing his life, as sad as that is.
Yeah, like, some of the issues with this take from Thaddeus Russell is that, like, he assumes that Daniel Penny has the same level of jiu-jitsu acumen that he does. I think Thaddeus Russell has like a blue or purple belt or something like that. And if you've ever been around jiu-jitsu, you know that that's like you're really, really good if you have a blue or purple belt. And you have lots of options, and jujitsu truly is like, it's a knowledge based sport in terms of like, if the more you know, you can overcome someone that is much stronger and more athletically gifted than you. But if you don't know anything about jujitsu and you don't know any jujitsu at all, like, you're just as helpless as anyone else in that situation. You're going to do what is going to come to you. It's also like you're saying, like, you don't know the situation or what it felt like, in that moment. And if anyone who's ever been in a fight, or whether it was, sparring like really hard, or in an actual fight with someone that wanted to hurt them, like, that if you are trying to win, there is no such thing as like a half measure. Like, you have to commit fully to whatever action you're going to do. And the fact of the matter is that a rear naked choke, like, it's not, you can't just kind of halfway do a rear naked choke. Like, if you do that and you don't succeed, like, the person could very well, if they have a knife on them, or if they have some other sort of, maybe they're much stronger than you, if you don't succeed, that might be the last chance you get to prevent violence from occurring. And so the fact of the matter is that once violence was initiated, and I think someone could argue that Jordan Neely threatening to kill people and hurt people on the subway train is like initiating the violence and lunging at people. Once that's initiated, like, all bets are off. And that's why people should try to avoid initiating violence and the prospect of initiating violence as much as possible, because once it kicks off, if you want to win, you can't have any half measures, and the chance of someone getting injured or killed is very, very high. And so the other aspect of this is too, is that Daniel Penny did a rear naked choke. Like, that choke, like, is used every day, thousands of times, hundreds of thousands of times, in thousands of jiu-jitsu gyms all across the country. Like, I myself just got choked out by that last week, and I did not die. And so people get passed out all the time from that, and it's generally one of the more safer things that you could probably do to someone, because you have the ability to understand whether they are conscious or not, and you have the ability to let go pretty quickly. So honestly, I can't personally, I'm not like a blue belt or a purple belt in jiu-jitsu. I've been training for about a year now, but I can't think of another, like, when they teach in like self-defense classes, and they teach if you have someone's back, like, the most high percentage successful yielding like submission that you have, and by submission, it's something to stop a threat, is a rear naked choke. There's a bunch of other like weird ones that probably won't work, or that they're transitions to another position or something like that might work in competition. But the fact of the matter is that when you're in like a life or death situation, which I think Daniel Penny and at least 3 other subway goers thought they were in, you go to the highest percentage chance of and the highest percentage move with the highest percentage chance of neutralizing the threat, and that's what he did. And I just think it's kind of weird for Thaddeus Russell to, Monday morning quarterback on this, especially when he has no idea what level of training Daniel Penny had.
Yeah, exactly. He's speaking out of a place of ignorance, just like a lot of the people who talk about anything gun related. And this, yeah, I feel like it'd be one thing if you were in the situation and you were one of the people who acted. If you were one of the 3, maybe, but it feels so it just feels so disconnected from reality to make this kind of a call without knowing the person, without knowing the situation intimately. Yeah, I think this is just kind of a bad take.
All right, moving on to our next one. We've got a next door post. This is next door in the area that I live in here in Washington. And this person writes, "This platform has taken a dangerous turn. In several posts recently, I am seeing people publicly chastising and shaming our youth for alleged typical teenage shenanigans, stating that their behavior could get them shot and killed. Why are we focusing on the behavior of children and not on violent crime and gun control? What a sad world we are living in, when random and rampant gun violence is just assumed and our children are shamed for just being kids." What do you think, Donnie?
I think this is a bad take. Like, there's traces of good in it, in the sense that, like, we should allow things for kids to be kids. But I tend to think that the behaviors that are being described here aren't kids just being kids. And I would also argue that the reality of the world as it is important to engage with and not wish for another. So, first of all, when we're talking about rampant gun violence, we also need to put it in context of where the most rampant gun violence is happening, and that is within gang culture. And so that's one of the very easy ways in which we can sort of curb those behaviors is by discouraging teenagers and kids from not doing shenanigans that get them involved in that way. But second, the idea of like, oh, if let's say that this gun violence is as rampant as they say, I can't believe we're telling kids to be smart and not put themselves in a in a way that would put them in danger instead of addressing the root issue. It's like, why are we teaching people to how to budget well and save their money instead of just giving, making there not be a recession or something. It's just like you're trying to presume the solution without telling people to live in the world they're in. It's just so backwards. I don't like this take at all. It feels very much like I want to blame all of the problems on this nebulous thing, like, and that would be solved with gun control. And I also want to discourage people from telling kids, like, hey, there are certain acceptable standards of behavior and you should also live in a way that keeps yourself safe from things that are real and present, no matter how you wish the world was. Just seems
Yeah.
very disconnected from reality.
Yeah, you and I both are basically the same age, and I think we both grew up in a time where you could do some of these types of pranks, and like some of the pranks that this poster talks about, is like TPing a house or like writing funny stuff on a person's car, like basically teenagers pranking each other and stuff like that. Not even really destroying property or something like that, but like that was a different time. And I think and by that what I mean is that like this person who advocates for gun control, I think, is probably also probably of the same ideology that advocates for lawlessness and not prosecuting people that do property damage and protecting property rights and things like that. And it made me think of, there was a video about 6 months ago of a neighborhood, not my neighborhood, but further down south. And these guys pretended to be cops. They were dressed up as cops, but they were actually robbers, and they had shotguns, and they ran up to this house, knocking, saying like, "Hey, police, open up!" And thankfully, the person had a camera and was like, "Oh yeah, that's not a cop's uniform," even though they're trying to disguise themselves. And they were kicking down the door, and they got in a gunfight. And thankfully, the property owner didn't get hurt or anything like that. But they were able to defend themselves. And it's like, okay, like that is a really common occurrence in Seattle. Not necessarily that exact one, but like violent people using violence upon property owners, and then the police and the government that is supposed to protect property owners because property owners pay property tax, not being there to enforce their property rights. And so when you let that cycle continue and it gets more and more violent and it gets more and more dangerous, and the margin for consideration about whether or not something is actually a threat gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and the penalty for being wrong about whether something is actually a threat becomes larger and larger and larger, suddenly property owners, when they see someone on their property, have to make split-second decisions that carry tons of consequence. And that is what people are talking about when they say, hey, like, we need to actually enforce property rights. We need to enforce the ability for there to not be, criminals that are doing these types of shenanigans, like actual shenanigans and bad things. Because when you let it go, suddenly property owners and people that are trying to just live their lives are left with they're left with really split-second decisions that carry huge consequences. And it would be better, the way you avoid getting to that point is making sure that really bad behavior doesn't occur in the first place, not incentivizing it by not prosecuting it and not not enabling it and not disarming the people that are supposed to defend themselves. So yeah, I would in the same way that the world that this person wants to live in, where teenagers can play pranks on each other and go on each other's properties and not be scared, that's a future I want. I also want the future where a homeowner sitting in their house doesn't have to fear anytime someone they don't know comes on their property. You have to have both for there to be a good world. And if you don't have both, then you're going to have what we have today.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And the other aspect is that when it comes to doing things that are pranks or shenanigans, I mean, part of the reality is like, clearly I don't think you should legislate against it. I think it's fine to warn kids like, hey, that's dangerous behavior. But part of doing those things is like, it is a risk. Like, what you're doing is
Yeah.
inherently risky, and kids should also be able to take risks. Now, I think, wise kids will learn from mistakes. They'll learn and they'll make calculated risks. But we also should be wary that, saying, hey, this is a thing, we shouldn't be policing their behavior. It's like, well, no, like letting kids know, hey, what you're doing is risky and like you need to be safe. Like, that's fine. Let them know and warn about that behavior, because that's how kids learn. Sometimes they'll have to do things, they'll make mistakes, but like letting kids risk things, but also making them aware, that's the best of both worlds. Like when you're a kid and you do something stupid, you can learn your lesson from doing something blindly and not knowing. But there's also merit in knowing what you're doing is risky and then, choosing to do that anyway, and maybe modifying your behavior in doing it, knowing it's a risk. Like I don't know. I think that there's just this kind of policing, like tut tut. Why are we focusing on this and not these gun control? I mean, the other thing is it's just a total false equivalence of what the actions are on this app of what is it called,
Next door.
Like as if going in and saying, hey, by the way, this kind of behavior is going to put you in danger. I'd really prefer it if you wouldn't be on my property. You might get shot. As if that's like the same level as, it's as easy to make that post as it is to go change the laws or whatever, or like just change this societal problem as they see it.
Yeah.
It's such a dumb equivalence to make on this app. And you're just mad because you are frustrated about something else and want people to take care of. I don't know. But it's just a weird thing to post. It feels like a Karen kind of just wanting to Karen, to be honest.
Yes, I mean, if any one of you are on next door, I think Karens will Karen on there all day long.
Ugh, man.
All right, this is our last one. So Michael Malice posted a New York Post article, and it's titled "The moment a New York City homeowner is arrested after having a tense standoff with squatters." For those of you who aren't familiar with the story, this homeowner, I think for the past 7 months, has not had access to their $1.1 million home in New York City because there are a bunch of squatters there. So she took it upon herself to go there and try to evict them. And when she did, the squatters called the police, and the police arrested her, the homeowner, for trying to evict the squatters. And Michael Malice reposts this and writes, "It is not possible to share a country with people who regard this as something other than an abomination." And then another user comments on this: "We have to dox these cops. Their names and pics need to be all over social media. They don't deserve peace." And then this is the take that we're going to critique. Another Twitter user comments on that other one about doxing the cops and writes, "The cops didn't do it. Go after the jerks who made the laws." What do you think, Donnie?
Such a stupid take. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Okay. Of course, the cops who are enforcing this are, like they can witness, they can see what's happening, and they can use their judgment. If we've come to a society where the people who are enforcing these bad laws that are so clearly and morally wrong are not able to stand up to them, then we're seriously doomed, and they deserve the sort of cowardice or the shame treatment because of their cowardice. Like we should not be trying to make excuses for the people who are, well, oh, they're just in a rough spot. They don't have any choice. I don't care. Like at that point, you stand down or you do something that gets you in trouble because it's the right thing to do, and that can suck. I get it, but oh my goodness, to pretend that there's no sort of moral issue here is just absurd and obscene. And I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, like the politicians are clearly in the wrong here too, but the cops are the ones doing it in the same way. Sort of the theme of the episode. It's like, making a law doesn't mean that things magically happen. People have to carry that out in the same way that a charity doesn't just get money and then do something. People have to physically do the things. Like the laws are made and the cops have to physically carry them out. That's just how it works. They have to do something. And so it's crazy to me that we're in a spot where people are trying to justify the very unethical carrying out of a law that's clearly unethical.
Yeah.
They are the arms. They are the things they are the ones that are making the things happen. They have culpability here.
One of the things when I read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's the Gulag Archipelago, he talks about how the Soviet Union and the police state and the fear of the police that came about and being taken and abducted in the middle of the night was actually the fault of everyone. Like you would like to blame it on Stalin or some communist or whatever, but his point is that it was the little lie that we each allowed every single day of our lives, and it just continued to grow and grow and grow and grow, and we kept vacating our moral duty to stand up for what is good, and by these little compromises, eventually we ended up to where someone could shout, "You're under arrest," and you would go be hauled off to Siberia and die in the cold there. And I think about like these cops and like we've joked about it before, but it's like, oh yeah, this is the Nuremberg defense, in a nutshell right here. And it's like we have outsourced all of our moral courage to people that are upstream of us or perceived to be upstream of us. And so we're like, oh, well, and we make it as an excuse to not be courageous in enforcing our principles and to not have our own principles. And so these cops, I'm sure that their line would be like, well, yeah, I didn't make the law, but I have to enforce it. Like, that's my duty. It's your duty as a citizen, to go change the law. And it's the duty of the politician to go change it. It's like, well, at some point, like someone has to do something, and realize that like, oh yeah, I'm not going to do what's wrong because I know it's wrong. And unfortunately, we have a society full of people that don't have that type of courage. And when we have a society that doesn't have that type of courage, we get leaders who definitely don't have that courage and are going to be evil and get away with as much as they possibly can. And like we talked about in one of the first takes, like we have laws for everything. And if we could measure, if the number of laws that we had was commiserate with, a moral society, like we should be the most moral society there ever was because we have so many of them. You literally can't set foot outside your door without breaking at least a few that could put you in prison or jail. And it just makes you realize that like, oh yeah, like the laws were not made by moral people now anymore. And they're definitely not enforced by moral people. And then the people that are moral and that maybe vote have no actual power to make those changes. And then the people that we're supposed to look to enforce them are also not moral like these cops are. So yeah, these cops are evil in the same way that like the cops during COVID, they might not have agreed or whatever with the governor's laws, but they went and they shut down businesses and they arrested people and they went and grabbed the person that was running by themselves on the beach, because they weren't social distancing and locked in their homes. It's like, yeah, they have no excuse. In my opinion, like they are just as culpable as the politicians who did the actual laws that were unjust in the first place.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I don't even think I have any more. Yeah. I think you put it well.
Cool. Well, I appreciate that, Donnie. I don't either. Well, on that, I guess we'll end. Folks, thanks so much for hanging out with us. We really appreciate it, and we will catch you on the next one.